I never imagined my life could shatter in a single night, until I saw my husband's best friend leaving our bedroom at 2 a.m. The way he looked at me, unapologetic and calm, made my stomach drop. I wanted to scream, to confront them both, but instead I stood frozen, clutching the doorknob, as their whispered words played over and over in my head. That moment changed everything, and I couldn't turn back. Emma and Ryan had what everyone called a picture-perfect marriage. High school sweethearts turned soulmates. They built their life on shared dreams and quiet evenings. Ryan, a successful architect, was the planner, steady and reliable. Emma, on the other hand, brought spontaneity and warmth, filling their home with laughter and love. But beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to form. Ryan's long hours at work slowly eroded the intimacy they once shared. Dinners turned into leftovers eaten alone, and Emma found herself scrolling through old photos, trying to remember when they last truly connected. Enter David, Ryan's childhood best friend. Charismatic, charming, and newly divorced, he had been around their lives for years. He was practically family, always dropping by unannounced, sharing drinks, and helping Ryan with projects around the house. Emma trusted him. Why wouldn't she? He was Ryan's best friend, the man who gave the toast at their wedding and held Ryan's hand through his mother's funeral. And yet, something had shifted. David's visits became more frequent, lingering even after Ryan left for work. He'd stay for coffee, offering Emma compliments that made her blush. She told herself it was harmless, that he was only being nice. But deep down, the attention felt intoxicating, especially when Ryan barely noticed her anymore. One evening, while Ryan was out of town for a conference, David stopped by with a bottle of wine. They talked about everything, dreams, regrets, and the loneliness neither of them dared to admit out loud. Emma laughed more that night than she had in months. When David brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, Emma froze. Her heart raced, and she quickly stepped away, blaming the wine. But the lingering look in his eyes stayed with her long after he left. That night, Emma lay awake in bed, staring at the empty space beside her. Guilt and desire battled inside her, and she hated herself for wondering, what if? Little did she know, the decision she'd make in the coming weeks would tear apart everything she once believed in. Emma tried to ignore the lingering tension after that night. She convinced herself it was a harmless moment, just two lonely people sharing a vulnerable conversation. But something had changed, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that David's eyes lingered a little too long, or that his compliments carried an edge she hadn't noticed before. It started subtly. David began texting her, first about random things like a movie recommendation or asking for her opinion on a work issue. Then, the messages became more personal. You looked amazing yesterday. Ryan's a lucky guy. Emma brushed it off as friendly banter, but her heart betrayed her every time her phone buzzed. Meanwhile, Ryan remained oblivious. He was buried in blueprints and deadlines, often coming home too exhausted to talk, let alone notice Emma's growing restlessness. She told herself it wasn't his fault. He was working hard to give them a better life. But the excuses felt thinner every day. The tipping point came one evening when Ryan announced another out-of-town trip. It's just 3 days, he said, kissing her cheek absent-mindedly. I'll make it up to you when I get back. But Emma barely heard him. Her mind was already spinning. 3 days. Alone. David showed up the next night. Just wanted to check in, he said, holding a 6-pack of beer and flashing that disarming smile. Emma hesitated before letting him in. They sat on the couch, talking about everything and nothing. But this time, the air between them felt different, charged. Emma noticed the way he leaned in closer, how his hand brushed against hers and lingered just a second too long. She should have stopped it, should have asked him to leave. Instead, she let it happen. The next day, guilt consumed her. She avoided David's texts and buried herself in chores, desperate to forget the way her pulse had quickened the night before. But the universe had other plans. That afternoon, she found something that made her stomach drop. David's jacket draped over the back of her kitchen chair. Ryan was due home in a few hours, and if he saw it, there would be questions. Questions Emma wasn't prepared to answer. Panic set in as she grabbed the jacket, but before she could put it away, her phone buzzed. It was David. Thinking about last night. Emma stared at the screen, her hands trembling. She knew she was walking a dangerous line, but part of her didn't want to stop. Then Ryan called. I'll be home early, he said cheerfully. Her heart sank. As the hours ticked by, Emma couldn't escape the feeling that her entire world was about to come crashing down. Emma barely slept that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Ryan slept soundly beside her, his breathing steady and unaware. Her phone sat on the nightstand, David's message still unread, but it felt like it was burning a hole in her conscience. She knew she should delete it, block his number, and pretend nothing ever happened. But she didn't. The next morning, Ryan left early for a meeting, pressing a quick kiss to her forehead as he grabbed his briefcase. Emma stood in the doorway, watching him drive away, feeling the weight of her guilt battling the ache of longing. Minutes later, her phone buzzed. "David, I need to see you." Emma's hands trembled as she typed her response. "Not today." But David didn't listen. An hour later, he was at her door. She tried to protest as he stepped inside, but the words died in her throat when he closed the distance between them. "Emma," he said softly, brushing his fingers against her cheek. "We can't keep pretending this isn't happening." Her heart pounded as she stepped back, shaking her head. "This is wrong, David. Ryan, he trusts us." "Does he?" David countered, his voice low but steady. "Because if he did, he wouldn't leave you here alone all the time. You deserve more than this." The words hit harder than Emma wanted to admit. She turned away, trying to collect herself, but David followed, his hands resting on her shoulders. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he whispered. And just like that, Emma's defenses crumbled. She turned, and before she could stop herself, her lips were on his. The kiss ignited something in her, something she had buried long ago. Desire, fear, and adrenaline tangled together as she let herself get swept up in the moment. Her hands clung to his shirt, as if letting go would break the spell. When they finally pulled apart, breathless and wide-eyed, Emma's mind raced. "This can't happen again," she said, her voice trembling. But David didn't let go. "It already has." Over the next few days, Emma found herself caught in a web of lies and stolen moments. David would show up unexpectedly, each visit pushing their boundaries further. She told herself it was just physical, just a distraction from the loneliness she felt with Ryan. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The guilt weighed heavily, but the thrill of secrecy made it impossible to stop. They met in quiet corners of the house when Ryan was at work, exchanged messages late at night, and invented excuses to spend time together. And then it happened. One afternoon, Emma was folding laundry when Ryan called. "I'm on my way home," he said. She froze. David was upstairs, in her bedroom. "Everything okay?" Ryan asked. "Yeah," Emma forced a laugh. "Just cleaning up. See you soon." The moment she hung up, panic set in. She ran up the stairs and burst into the room where David was lounging on the bed. "You have to go now." David stood, his expression calm. "Relax. We'll figure it out." "No, David, you don't understand. Ryan's almost here." They scrambled. David slipped out the back door, just as Ryan's car pulled into the driveway. Emma leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath as Ryan walked in, smiling and oblivious. But later that night, as Emma lay beside her husband, she realized something terrifying. She didn't feel guilty anymore. Instead, she felt alive. What she didn't realize was that someone had noticed. Madison, Ryan's assistant, had seen David's car parked outside the house earlier that day. She hadn't said anything yet, but the look she gave Emma the next time they crossed paths made her blood run cold. Emma knew the walls were closing in. She just didn't know how much time she had left before everything fell apart. Emma's hands trembled as she washed the dishes, her mind replaying the events of the past week. Every stolen moment with David felt like a ticking time bomb, and Madison's knowing stare had only made the paranoia worse. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. That night, Ryan came home earlier than usual. Madison mentioned she saw David's car here the other day, he said casually, setting his briefcase on the counter. Emma froze. She kept her back turned, hoping he wouldn't see the panic flashing across her face. "Oh," she said lightly. "Yeah, he stopped by to drop off some tools Ryan left at his place." Ryan's eyes narrowed. "And he stayed for how long?" Emma forced a laugh. "Not long." "Why?" "Just wondering," he said, but the doubt in his tone lingered. Over the next few days, Emma became more careful. She avoided David's calls and ignored his messages, hoping distance would cool the fire they'd started. But David wouldn't let go that easily. One evening, Ryan announced he had a late meeting. Relief washed over Emma, until David showed up at the door. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, glancing over her shoulder. "I needed to see you," he said, stepping inside. "You've been avoiding me." "Because this has to stop," she snapped. "It's too risky." Before David could respond, they heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling into the driveway. "Ryan!" Panic gripped Emma. She shoved David toward the back door. Go. Now. David hesitated, but eventually slipped out the back, just as Ryan walked through the front. Emma forced a smile, her heart pounding in her chest. You're home early. Ryan set his keys on the table and looked at her carefully. Madison called me. She said she saw David's car here again. Emma's stomach dropped. She thinks something's going on, Ryan continued. And honestly, so do I. Emma felt her world collapse. She tried to laugh it off. That's ridiculous, Ryan. Is it? He interrupted, stepping closer. Because lately you've been distant. Distracted. And now I find out David's been here. Twice. I told you. No, Emma. Ryan's voice rose. Don't lie to me. Tears welled in her eyes as she scrambled for words. It's not what you think. But before she could finish, Ryan's phone buzzed. A message. From Madison. Check the security footage. Ryan's eyes locked on hers. Security cameras, he said slowly. Emma's blood ran cold. She had completely forgotten about the cameras Ryan had installed months ago after a string of neighborhood break-ins. Ryan. But he was already pulling up the footage on his phone. The screen played back a nightmare. David's car parked in the driveway. Him walking inside. The way they lingered too close in the living room. And then, Emma opening the back door, hurried and frantic, pushing David out just minutes before Ryan walked in. Ryan's face turned pale. Oh my God, he whispered. Ryan, please. Don't. His voice was sharp. Don't insult me with excuses. Emma stepped toward him, but he recoiled. You've been sleeping with him, haven't you? Tears streamed down her face. I'm so sorry. Sorry. Ryan laughed bitterly. You're sorry? Do you have any idea what you've done? What you've destroyed? Before Emma could respond, the doorbell rang. Madison. Ryan didn't hesitate. He opened the door, and Madison stepped inside, her expression smug. I thought you'd want to know the truth, she said, handing Ryan a folder. What's this? Emma asked, her voice trembling. Ryan opened it, and Emma's breath caught. Photos. Screenshots from the security cameras. Printouts of text messages David had sent her. I had a private investigator follow David, Madison said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. And it turns out he's been visiting more than just your house, Emma. He's been sleeping around with half the women in this neighborhood. Emma's knees buckled, and she sank into a chair. You didn't just betray me, Ryan said, his voice breaking. You did it with someone who never even cared about you. David's lies crashed down around her, and for the first time, Emma saw the truth. She hadn't just risked her marriage. She'd risked everything for a man who never intended to stay. Get out, Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ryan. Out. Emma grabbed her keys and ran out the door, her heart pounding as the weight of her choices hit her all at once. As she sat in her car, tears streaming down her face, her phone buzzed again. David. What did he say? Are you okay? Emma stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keys. And then, slowly, she turned off the phone. Because no matter how much she wanted to believe the lie, it was time to face the truth. Emma sat in her car, staring blankly at the dashboard as the weight of everything came crashing down. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, the echo of Ryan's voice, broken and betrayed, playing over and over in her head. She wanted to scream, to cry, to turn back time and undo the choices that had led her here. But it was too late. She checked her phone again. David. Another missed call. Another message. You can't just leave like that. Talk to me. But she didn't reply. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she even wanted to. She drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. Eventually, she ended up at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions. Alone in the dimly lit room, Emma finally allowed herself to fall apart. The tears came hard and fast, her sobs echoing off the walls. She had ruined everything, her marriage, her stability, and the trust she had taken for granted. And for what? A few stolen moments that now felt more like a nightmare than a fantasy. But the worst part wasn't losing Ryan. It was realizing that she had never really known David. When the knock came at the door, Emma froze. She wiped her tears and slowly approached, her heart racing. Emma, open up, David's voice called through the door. She hesitated before unlocking it. He stepped inside, his expression a mix of frustration and desperation. You've been ignoring me. What the hell is going on? What's going on? Emma snapped, her voice shaking. Everything fell apart, David. Ryan knows. Madison knows. And now I'm the one left with nothing. David stepped closer, reaching for her, but she pulled away. You said we'd figure it out, he argued. No, David, Emma said, her voice firm despite the tears. You said that. I believed you. But the truth is, this was never about us, was it? You just wanted the thrill, the attention, something to make yourself feel better after your divorce. David's jaw tightened. That's not fair. Isn't it? Emma shot back. Madison told Ryan everything. She even hired someone to dig into you. And guess what? You've been sleeping with other women, probably feeding them the same lies you fed me. His face darkened. You really believe her? I don't know what to believe anymore. David reached out again, but Emma stepped back. I can't do this, she said softly. Not anymore. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at her like he didn't recognize the woman in front of him. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Alone again, Emma collapsed onto the bed, her entire body trembling. The next day, she called Ryan. He didn't answer. Over the following week, Emma tried to repair the damage. She sent texts, left voicemails, even showed up at his office once, but he refused to see her. Madison made sure of that. You need to leave him alone, Madison said coldly when Emma cornered her in the parking lot. Ryan deserves better than this. Emma wanted to argue, to defend herself, but she didn't have the energy. 2 weeks later, Ryan filed for divorce. The process was swift and brutal. Emma signed the papers without protest, knowing she didn't have the right to fight. She packed her things, moved out of the house they had built together, and watched as Ryan erased every trace of her from his life. As for David, he disappeared. No calls, no messages, nothing. It was as if he had never existed, leaving Emma to pick up the pieces alone. In the end, it wasn't just her marriage she lost. It was her sense of self. Emma sat in the small, dimly lit apartment she now called home. It wasn't much, a far cry from the house she had shared with Ryan, but it was hers. Boxes still lined the walls, unpacked and gathering dust, as if she couldn't quite accept this was her new reality. The divorce papers were final. There was no going back. Ryan had moved on, or at least that's what Madison's social media updates suggested. Photos of him smiling at company events, surrounded by friends, and Madison always nearby. Emma couldn't help but wonder if Madison had been waiting for her to fail. But none of that mattered anymore. She had spent the last few weeks drowning in regret, replaying every choice she had made and wishing she could rewrite the story. The guilt had eaten her alive at first, but now it felt more like a dull ache, a constant reminder of what she had destroyed. The truth was, her affair with David hadn't been about love. It hadn't even been about him. It was about the loneliness she felt, the emptiness that had crept into her marriage, and the desperate need to feel wanted again. But the price of that momentary escape was far higher than she'd ever imagined. She lost Ryan, the man who had stood by her through her darkest moments, who had loved her even when she couldn't love herself. She lost the life they had built together, the dreams they had shared. And for what? For a fantasy. Looking back, Emma realized the signs had been there all along. She had ignored them, the late nights, the distance, the unspoken resentment, because facing them would have meant admitting something was broken. Instead, she let herself believe that David was the answer, when in reality, he was just another distraction. Emma knew now that love wasn't about excitement or stolen moments. It was about showing up, day after day, even when things felt hard. It was about honesty, trust, and vulnerability, all the things she had taken for granted. And while it was too late to fix her marriage, it wasn't too late to fix herself. She started therapy not to make excuses, but to understand why she had let herself fall so far. She joined a support group for women going through divorce, where she heard stories that reminded her she wasn't alone. Slowly, Emma began to rebuild her life. One afternoon, as she was packing up old photos, she came across a picture of her and Ryan on their wedding day. They looked so happy, so full of hope. She traced her finger over his face, her chest tightening. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not for the first time. But this time, it wasn't just an apology to Ryan. It was an apology to herself, for not valuing what she had, for letting her insecurities and fears drive her to self-destruction. Emma didn't know what the future held. She wasn't sure if she would ever find love again, or if she even wanted to. For now, she was focused on learning to be okay on her own, on forgiving herself, even if Ryan never would. Because if she had learned anything, it was this. One mistake can destroy everything, but it doesn't have to define who you are. What would you have done if you were in Emma's shoes? Could you have walked away before it was too late? Or do you think some mistakes are inevitable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories filled with secrets, betrayal, and the twists you never see coming, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. You won't believe what's coming next.